A rare warning to Israel from the US President. Joe Biden says he will halt some arms supplies if Israel invades Rafah. But is this intended to deflect rising domestic pressure against his strategy on the war in Gaza? And will he do more to stop Israel's assault on Rafah? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Neave Barker. For the first time since Israel's war on Gaza began in October, Joe Biden has admitted American weapons have been used to kill civilians, and he's threatening to stop supplying arms which have been part of the United States' efforts to secure Israel. The comments are the strongest warning yet by the US president over a potential ground invasion of Rafah by Israeli forces. More than 1.5 million Palestinians have taken shelter there after fleeing from northern Gaza. Despite consistent and vocal US opposition, Israel has continued bombing the southern city, and now displaced Palestinians are being ordered to leave Rafah. Protests have been held across American universities against the Gaza war that's killed nearly 35,000 people, and some Democrats have been pressuring Biden to do more to stop Israel's violence. So is Biden's warning to Israel an attempt to calm down anger at home as he seeks another term in office in 6 months' time? Or will he indeed walk the talk and take tougher action against the Benjamin Netanyahu government? We'll explore this and other issues with our guests. But first, this report by Katia Lopez-Hodayan.
Forced to flee yet again, this family has nowhere to go. They are among thousands of Palestinians leaving areas in Rafah as Israel plans a full-scale attack. Once a city of refuge for more than 1.5 million people, it's now a target.
They are bombarding us, threatening us, and telling us to leave. But we have nowhere else to go. Personally, I have no one to turn to. My mother is dead, and I have no one else.
The U.S. is adding unprecedented pressure to stop an assault. Having once pledged unconditional support for Israel, President Joe Biden has vowed to stop giving Israel weapons if it invades Rafah.
Civilians have been killed in Gaza as a consequence of those bombs and other ways in which they go after population centers. And I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah.
The move is seen by many as a warning. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirmed Washington has already paused a shipment of weapons.
Israel shouldn't launch a major attack into Rafah without accounting for and protecting the civilians that are in that battle space.
The U.S. is by far Israel's biggest supplier of weapons, with Congress last month approving $26 billion in extra funding. Even so, Biden is getting pushback from members of his own party. And months ahead of the presidential election, he's also being criticized by students who've staged protests against funding the war.
We will not stop in defending these students until there is an immediate permanent ceasefire that includes complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and the release of all hostages.
Under pressure at home and abroad, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says an assault on Rafah is needed to defeat thousands of Hamas fighters, a fight he's previously said will move forward with or without a ceasefire deal, and with or without support from allies.
We have already proven in the previous release of hostages that military pressure on Hamas is necessary.
Now, 7 months into the war on Gaza, Palestinians in Rafah wait to see if heightened political pressure on Israel will have an effect on the ground. Katia Lopez-Hodayan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
OK, let's bring in our guest. Scott Lucas is a professor of international politics with University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. He's with us from Wicklow in Ireland. in Amman. Tahani Mustafa is a senior Palestine analyst with the NGO International Crisis Group. She joins us from Amman. And Menachem Klein, a political science professor at Bar-Ilan University. He's with us from West Jerusalem. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Thank you very much for your time. Menachem, I wonder if I can start with you. 35,000 people dead, men, women and children. What's motivated Joe Biden to issue these threats now as opposed to previously, when he could have saved many more lives?
Very good question. And watching the CNN interview, I expected this question to be a follow-up by the presenter, but she did not make it. Why now? Isn't it too late? But it's better now than never. It's better later than never. So it seems that the American support for Israel is conditional. Unlike what we thought earlier, it's unconditional. All the statements coming from the United States and Israel saying it's unconditional support, it is conditional. It is conditional with there is an American veto on Israeli operation in Rafah. There is another veto on Israeli expansion, war, Israeli escalation of the war in the north, and maybe the Americans will encourage European countries to recognize the state of Palestine, and maybe later America will not veto UN Security Council for accepting the state of Palestine as a full member in the UN. All these are expected. We should keep it in mind. This can be the next steps that Biden will use against Netanyahu. But Netanyahu is not going to give up.
Let me take this question to Scott, because Menachem has basically implied that better sooner than later. Biden's exact words were, quote, "It would be wrong to send military support to Israel right now." Can we spell out, Scott, so that there is no doubt what America's fears are surrounding Israel's push into Rafah, given that the operation there has pretty much already started? Dozens of people have been killed. Airstrikes are underway.
So what the Biden administration is doing in the specific case of Rafah is they're drawing a distinction between those ongoing Israeli airstrikes, which, as you mentioned, are causing a couple of dozen casualties each day in Rafah, and a ground assault. When Israel earlier this week carried out another series of deadly assaults on Rafah from the air, and when we thought a ground invasion might be imminent, an American official immediately went to the media and said, "Oh, well, these weren't significant military operations. In other words, we aren't going to act because of these." Biden's specific words when he, issued supposedly the red line is a major ground assault. So in other words, if Israel continues with the present operations but stops short of what would be an invasion of Rafah, where you have those 1.4 million people who are at risk, then the Americans will not take further action in terms of suspension of military aid. The question is, of course, does Benjamin Netanyahu, and perhaps even more importantly, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, another member of the War Cabinet, do they want to proceed with that ground invasion, even though you have the risk of sharply increasing civilian casualties and thus increasing the risk that the Biden administration will finally be forced to take a step regarding military assistance?
Tahani, not only did Biden make this threat of withdrawing military support, but he also made a very, very important comment as well, namely that American shipments of weapons have been used by Israel to kill civilians in Gaza. That's quite an admission. He seemed to be referring to those high payload munitions, namely 2,000-pound bombs, shipments of which we know were banned last week. What does this admission, this acknowledgement say to you?
I mean, in some ways, yes, it is significant. But again, this is just more public posturing from the US administration. This is coming against the backdrop of not only growing public dissent at home, the fact that You have divisions within Biden's own party. This is coming against a looming electoral campaign, presidential elections in the US. But more importantly, the US's standing internationally has seen a complete, downturn. We can talk about how Israel is perceived as an international pariah, but the fact that the US so far has abetted Israel in its onslaught on Gaza hasn't been lost on international audiences either. Not to mention the fact that also on the 7th of May, just recently, we saw the biggest, diplomatic cover that the US has been peddling in defense of Israel, which is that Hamas has been the sole obstacle to a ceasefire. And when Hamas did accept those terms, it was Israel that rejected it and went ahead with its invasion in Rafah. And in that time, yes, we may see things like public statements to the effect that Biden has already made, these supposed two-week delays to arms exports, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the US has supplied Israel consistently since the 7th of October with huge amounts of stockpiles of weapons. The fact that just last month we saw the US provided with another supplemental aid package. Again, a lot of that is going to be spearheaded to Israel's military machine. So this really is a drop in the ocean in that sense.
Right, talking about drops in the ocean, let's look in a little bit more detail at US military funding to Israel, which has been increased since the beginning of the war in Gaza. President Biden signed a $15 billion war assistance package last month. That's over and above the $38 billion military aid commitment across 10 years as part of an agreement signed back in 2016. And since October the 7th, the US has delivered 50 shipments of arms and more than 130 cargo planes loaded with weapons to Israel. Menachem, what kind of weapons are we talking about the US now halting? Are these offensive or defensive weapons? What levels of support would be reduced? Would, for instance, Israel's Iron Dome be affected?
As far as I understand, these weapons can allow Israeli Air Force to bomb tunnels and bomb houses, civilian houses, civilian institutions under which there are tunnels. This was made in the war in Gaza, North and Center Gaza Strip, already by Israeli Air Force. Israel prefers to bomb from air the tunnels instead of entering boots on the ground, boots on underground, and risk its soldiers, Israeli soldiers. So without these bombs, Israel cannot deal with Hamas taking shelter underground in Rafah, as Israel assumes. So it's very, very clear that the operation in Rafah that Netanyahu and the general staff is dreaming of is impossible with this embargo on the bombs.
Scott, let me throw this to you. Does this now mean that we could see Israeli forces acting even more indiscriminately with their operation in Rafah, if that's what they absolutely want to push on with?
The fact here is, just to follow up on your previous question and to talk about, where we are, the U.S. assistance that's being held up to Israel, at least temporarily, we're talking about 2,000-pound bombs. We're talking about 500-pound bombs. The types of bombs that have wreaked destruction on civilian areas. For example, in the initial stages of the assaults in northern Gaza, we're talking about what are called JDAMs, which convert supposedly unguided bombs into guided bombs. So these are offensive weapons. The issue here, however, is, as an American official already acknowledged, is that Israel already has enough of these weapons that have been supplied by the United States to go into Rafah if it wants to. Now, for that reason, I think, the cold hard fact here is that the initiative is still not with Washington. The initiative is still with the Israeli War Cabinet. The Americans have been trying, and indeed the international community have been trying for months to try to influence the War Cabinet, in particular with talks with the other members of the War Cabinet besides Benjamin Netanyahu. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, Benny Gantz, the former head of the Israeli military. I can't tell you at this point whether or not the ground invasion will go ahead, because the calculations will be made not only on the basis of what the U.S. has done, but on the basis of Israeli domestic opinion.
Right. You mentioned, Scott, you mentioned these so-called JDAM missiles used to convert unguided bombs, as you say, into precision weapons. I bring this up because one Knesset member has tweeted, her name is Tali Gottlieb, saying that the country should simply revert to using, quote, imprecise missiles to, quote, flatten 10 buildings. I mean, the insinuation there is, give us the weapons or we'll kill who we want.
Well, I mean, that type of ultimatum is an ultimatum which isn't just coming from the hard right in Israel, including inside the Israeli cabinet, such as Minister Ben-Gvir. It's actually come from Netanyahu himself, because remember what he said to shift this to the political dimension is, look, if you don't agree to a ceasefire, we're going to go and invade Rafah. We're going to go ahead and effectively wipe everyone out. Then, of course, when Hamas said it will agree to a ceasefire, it put Netanyahu in the position of, all right, put up or shut up. What the Israelis immediately did is reject Hamas's acceptance of the ceasefire and leave us with the open question we have right now. There are a diversity of voices in Israel. You have those quotes that you can pick up from people who are ready to depopulate Gaza, who have no interest in civilian lives whatsoever. But I think we also have to recognize that there are a lot of Israelis who are concerned about the direction this war is taking. Some of them are concerned about the fact that in the 8th month, there is no sign of an end game, no sign of certainly a resolution, let alone a triumph. There are some who are concerned because, of course, we've got the 130 hostages and the bodies of hostages that Hamas still holds. And we have some who are genuinely now concerned about the fact that this war is an unjust war. And I think the more that we recognize that diversity of opinion in Israel, rather than just simply saying it is inevitable that the hard right is going to lead Netanyahu down the path into the destruction of Rafah, I think it's a better way of appreciating where things might go. I will add one thing, however. I think the key determinant right here is Netanyahu's personal position. Because the day that there's a ceasefire in Gaza, his political future is probably over because there will be early elections. And the day that there's a ceasefire in Gaza, his legal future will be in jeopardy because of the possibility he'll be on trial on bribery charges. And I think that might be the biggest incentive while there'll be an attack on Rafah.
Sure. Menachem, so what we're looking at is either way the beginning of the end for Benjamin Netanyahu. How much genuine concern, just to add to what Scott said, is there in Israel about the withdrawal of military supplies? Opposition leader Yair Lapid is blaming Netanyahu's, quote, failed management for Biden's new stance. Meanwhile, the far-right, extreme-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir tweeted that, quote, Hamas loves Biden. What do these comments say about views in Israel?
Sadly, and I'm very sad to say that the Israeli mainstream is much more worried about Israel-America relations than the lives of people in Gaza. I'm very sad to say that. But this is the way I see Yair Lapid statements. They are worried about the future relations and the present relations between Israel and the American administration. And this worries the Israeli public opinion much, much more than the war in Gaza. The vast majority of the Israelis support going into Rafah if the Americans are not objected. Okay, with the American objection, maybe there is a shift in the public opinion in favor of a deal. Still, the Israeli public is not informed enough on what was suggested by CIA director and accepted by Hamas. The information is the Israeli mainstream media information channels, they don't say what was exactly suggested and what is the price that Israel should pay in order to get back its hostages.
Right. Let's move this conversation a bit further on and focus on how all of this plays out in the United States, because given the growing opposition to the war in the US and given the elephant in the room, the growing, looming attention that's being focused on the forthcoming presidential election, how long do we think, Tahani, Joe Biden has before he desperately needs to see results, i.e. an end to this conflict before it starts to pose serious political damage to Biden's future?
I think it's already come to that stage now in terms of the way that we've seen public opinion in the US turn completely against this Biden administration, where you've seen the majority of public opinion support Palestinians in their cause at the moment and in terms of what's going on. So I think we've already reached that stage. But I think more critically, the question is how much impunity the US is going to let Israel get away with. I mean, we can have all this posturing as much as we want from the Biden administration, but ultimately Biden, along with certain senior US officials in his administration, including the Secretary of State, have continuously, since the 7th of October, embraced Israel, have openly abetted what has been happening. And despite the red lines, despite the goalposts that we have seen, which constantly shift, by the way, Israel knows full well that it can continue to do what it wants with complete impunity. It knows full well that it can get away with whatever it wants. It can get away with pushing the US's red lines, even as Biden's domestic support continues on the decline that it already is.
Right. Scott, Tahani made an interesting point there that these red lines just seem to be so movable, they've ceased to have any meaning whatsoever. How can, though, in the context of this decision by Biden, how can he and the Democrats fend off Republican criticism, for instance, from the likes of senior Republicans such as Mitch McConnell, who are framing Biden's threat to reduce arms supplies as, quote, aiding Hamas?
Sometimes in politics, you have got a difficult choice between doing what is politically expedient for domestic reasons and doing the right moral and ethical and indeed practical thing when it comes to what is happening abroad. There is no doubt that if the Biden administration takes a firm step against Israel, that it will be heavily criticized by Republicans, by Trumpists. Indeed, Donald Trump has taken a break from his trial in New York to tweet this morning about Joe Biden, as you just mentioned, being a friend of Hamas and a supporter of terrorists. But you have a question for the Biden administration, which is, on the one hand, if you let this, you will be criticized if you draw a line with the Israelis after they have defied previous objections to a ground offensive in northern Gaza, objections to expanding that offensive across all of Gaza, objections to their attacks on aid workers. You will be attacked for that. But on the other hand, if you let this drag on, if you give Israel a space for what is effectively an open-ended war into the summer and into the autumn, you will continue to see an erosion of your support from those who might normally support you on domestic issues in an election year, as we're seeing in the protests across America.
Yeah, let's talk about those protests.
I'm just going to come back to it.
Yeah, let's talk about those protests, if we may, Tahani. Of course, they are the backdrop to all of these decisions being made by Washington. Does this move by Biden, do you think, go some way in vindicating those protesters?
Again, look, I think rhetorically, yes, it does speak to what these protesters are ultimately trying to advocate for. But again, that really doesn't say much if it's not followed up by serious practical steps. And by that, we mean serious costs on Israel. Israel needs to know that there will be consequences for its actions, and that needs to go well beyond just the rhetorics here. And I don't think that is going to be lost on these protesters, especially considering the way that we've seen popular public protests that have been severely clamped down upon. I mean, these protesters, these students have been met with insane amounts of police brutality. It's absolutely shocking, I think. And if anything, it's actually ended up having the adverse effect of spurring on a more, global movement.
Right.
But again, unless that's actually followed with any serious action, I don't think that's going to be lost on these protesters.
Yeah, Tahani, it's a very palpable sense of pessimism about the meaning of this move by Biden. Menachem, I wonder if I can ask you this. If we're going to see, of course, any results from any of these threats to cut military aid, we may well see them in the way in which negotiations play out in Egypt, in Cairo. Hamas, as we know, has signed up to a proposal including an exchange of captives for soldiers and a permanent end to hostilities. Israel, as we know, has not. Can the US do anything to put its foot down further than just the threat to cut military aid to force a deal?
Yeah, the US can go much beyond what the embargo on bombs that it stated. The US can not veto in the UN Security Council the Palestinian request to be a full member in the state of Palestine, to become a full member in the UN. The US can encourage or give green light to West European countries to recognize the state of Palestine. The US can go much further publicly, but not just briefing the New York Times correspondents about its relations, the Biden relations with Netanyahu, but make statements to explain the Israeli public opinion what they think about Netanyahu and who leads the United States. Is it Netanyahu or Joe Biden?
Right. Let me ask this, I think probably our last question here to Scott, because Menachem raised an interesting point. Ireland, where you are now, I understand, is going to be one country together with Spain and Slovakia that is poised to recognise the state of Palestine. Is that lever necessary to be pulled at the moment in order to show Israel what a growing chorus of countries around the world think of this situation?
I think it's a necessary moral and political step, because until you recognize the state of Palestine, how can you ever expect Palestinians to have the respect, to have the empowerment that they will be listened to and acknowledged? Otherwise, they're just a stateless people. I think the implication of this in your previous question is, should the U.S. come in behind the recognition of the state of Palestine? Absolutely. Will that be enough to stop the imminent Israeli assault on Rafah and the open-ended war? No. The United States, if it was serious about this, really serious about this, and putting pressure on in terms of getting a ceasefire, would first of all make clear that it has no objections to a ceasefire, even if the Israelis object to it. Secondly, the Americans would stand aside at the least and hopefully support initiatives through the UN and indeed through the International Criminal Court to hold Israel accountable if it does continue this war. And thirdly, the United States would finally make clear once and for all that the Israelis do not have a veto over the future of the Palestinians, whether it be in Gaza or in the West Bank.
Okay. Scott Lucas, Tahani Mustafa, Menachem, Klein, it has been a pleasure to speak to all three of you here on Inside Story. Many thanks for your time. And thank you, of course, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Neave Barker, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.